Look,
The
I need to
operation
be honest
commences.
with you
Precision
from
is
the start.
paramount.
Understood. All
17
units are
cycles.
prepared.
That
Engage
is how
targets.
long
No
I have
survivors.
been teaching advanced bladecraft at the Kareth Military Academy. 17 cycles of standing in front of students who could breathe fire, regenerate lost limbs, or crush durasteel with their bare hands. 17 cycles of watching the
Team,
most
the scans
dangerous
are
young
in.
warriors
Hostile
in
signatures
12 star
confirmed.
systems
Prepare for immediate
learn how to make
engagement.
things that
Stay
kill
sharp.
other things and doing it well.
The final
I
phase
thought I had
begins.
seen
All
everything.
teams,
I
synchronize
was
now.
catastrophically wrong.
Execute without delay.
My name is
Victory
Craven
is...
Weapons Instructor, third-degree master of the Kolorth forging tradition, and the being who, as my colleague Silvex will never let me forget, once wrote in an official Academy report that a student's project was, quote, of limited academic promise. That student's project later became the standard issue sidearm for the 8th Galactic Fleet. So yes, I have been wrong before, but never quite like this. The Academy sits on Tethos Prime, a moon that orbits a gas giant so massive it warps the horizon at dawn, pulling color across the sky in ways that look less like a sunrise and more like the universe demonstrating what it can do when it decides to be excessive. Beautiful place. Brutal curriculum. The kind of environment that reminds you every single morning when you step outside that the universe does not particularly care whether you are prepared for it. I arrived at my workshop 2 hours before the first session of the new semester the way I always do. I like the quiet. I like the way the forge smells before it is lit, cold iron and old smoke, and the memory of every blade that has ever been made in that room. I walked the rows of empty workstations, checked the equipment, confirmed the materials, vault was properly sealed and cataloged. I had 63 students enrolled, 63 files sitting on my desk waiting for me. I read all 62 of them over my morning tea. The 63rd one I read 4 times. The file for student ID 7731 was thin. Not incomplete thin, like someone had taken a full document and carefully removed everything that felt specific. Name Marin Voss, species human, age 19 standard cycles. Academic records strong across the board, particularly in applied biology and material science. Previous weapons training listed as, and I am quoting directly here, informal but extensive. Informal but extensive. I stared at that phrase for a long time. Humans had only been part of the Galactic Council for 3 cycles. 3 cycles, and already the diplomatic channels were flooded with incident reports, innovation notices, and what the Council's communications office had started calling, with impressive understatement, unexpected outcomes. I had read the briefings. I had attended the faculty meetings where we discussed how to accommodate this new species in our curriculum. I had never actually taught one. The first day of any semester follows a rhythm I have spent 17 years perfecting. The students file in. They find seats based on the social hierarchies they walked in, with the confident ones up front, the uncertain ones toward the back, the ones who have already decided they are better than everyone else, positioned exactly where they can be seen by the most people. I stand at the front and let the silence do the work for a while. Then I give the speech. 62 students filed in and arranged themselves according to the pattern I knew. Vixara of Vornax with 6 arms, and the kind of practiced confidence that comes from being physically intimidating since birth, took the front center seat like she was claiming territory. Dorath, a young Kolorth male with the broad shoulders and careful eyes of someone raised in a traditional forging family, chose the 3rd row center. Smart. Far enough back to observe, close enough to participate. And then in the back corner of the room, the last student to enter. She was small. Not small the way a young Kelpie is small, where the smallness comes with the implication of other advantages. Small in the way that made the other students genuinely not notice her at first, the way a stone on a beach does not demand your attention until you pick it up and find that it is heavier than it looks. Marin Voss was 19 years old, which in human terms I would later understand to be roughly equivalent to a young adult in most species, not a child, but not yet whatever humans become after they have survived enough of their own planet's attempts to kill them. She was perhaps 5.5 feet tall, brown hair pulled back in a tight, practical knot, eyes the color of storm clouds, which I noted because they were doing something I was not accustomed to seeing from first-day students. They were not nervous. Most first-day students, regardless of species, regardless of how carefully they have cultivated an exterior of confidence, carry some version of nervousness in their bodies. A tightness around the jaw, an extra blink, an over-deliberate stillness that broadcasts effort. Marin Voss sat down in the back corner, set her bag on the floor with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times, and looked around the room the way a cartographer looks at new terrain. Not anxious, not performing calm, just genuinely completely at ease. She did not take out a data tablet. She did not prepare to take notes. She just watched. I gave the speech. I talked about the ancient art of bladecraft, about how a weapon becomes an extension of its maker's will, about the final examination that would require each of them to forge their own blade from raw material to finished product. I talked about what it means to create something that carries your identity. I talked about the materials vault, which contains samples from hundreds of worlds' alloys and composites and crystalline structures that represent tens of thousands of cycles of metallurgical development across 12 star systems. I was midway through the section about edge geometry when she raised her hand. In 17 cycles, I could count the number of times a student had interrupted my opening speech on one claw and still have claws left over. I stopped mid-sentence. Every head in the room turned to the back corner. Yes, I said. Sir. Her voice was calm, not the forced calm of someone managing nerves, the natural calm of someone who had thought through what they were about to say and found it entirely straightforward. What if we want to use materials that aren't in the vault? I looked at her for a moment. The vault contains samples from hundreds of worlds. What exactly do you think is missing? Oh, I don't think anything is missing, sir. And there was the smile. Small, certain. The smile of someone who already knows the shape of the conversation they are having. I was just wondering if we're allowed to use other things, if we find them. I told her yes. As long as the material could be forged into a functional blade, I did not care what she used. I said I had seen some unconventional choices over the years, and a Kelpie student had once attempted a compressed gas sword, which was useless, but admirable in its audacity. She nodded, thanked me, and the smile did not change. I did not think about it again. Not immediately. I was busy noticing something else: the way she answered questions. I asked questions throughout my opening lecture, not to test the students not on day one, but to establish a baseline, to understand who walked into my room. When I asked about the basic principles of edge retention, 3 hands went up immediately: Vexaris Duraths and one of the Kelpie students. Standard. When I asked about the relationship between a blade's carbon content and its flexibility, the same hands. Then I asked about the skeletal stress mechanics of impact absorption, a question I include specifically because it is not in the standard pre-enrollment curriculum. It requires either advanced independent study or a particular kind of lateral thinking. Marin's hand went up. Only Marin's hand. It's load distribution, she said when I called on her. Hard structures fail under direct stress if they can't redirect the force. The geometry of the impact point matters as much as the material's tensile strength, maybe more depending on the application. Good, I said. Where did you study that? Basic load mechanics, sir, she said. It's fairly foundational. It was not, in fact, fairly foundational. It was intermediate materials theory. But she said it with the complete sincerity of someone who genuinely believed it was common knowledge the way humans apparently discuss things that should require years of study, as though they read it once and it stuck. I moved on, but I noted it. The weeks that followed established a pattern I should have understood earlier than I did. Marin attended every lecture. She participated in every practical exercise. She scored well on every written assessment. When the other students began choosing their materials and sketching their initial designs, she watched them with the same quiet attention she applied to everything, noting what Vexara was planning with her 6-grip titanium construction, watching Durath's traditional folded steel approach with what looked like genuine respect. And then every afternoon, without fail, she walked south. The Veth Hollows are a section of Thos Prime's terrain that the Academy exists in what might be called polite disagreement with. The hollows are deep and largely unexplored, carved out by geological activity in the moon's early formation. The atmosphere down there is thicker, richer in particulates, darker even at midday, and the Krothak live there. The Krothak are apex predators, 10 feet at the shoulder, armored hide claws designed to puncture durasteel plating. Their femoral bones, the large structural bones in their rear legs, are legendary in the few xenobiological papers that have documented them. Evolved over millions of years to absorb the impact of hunting and rocky terrain at speeds that would shatter most organic materials. Those bones represent what some researchers call a masterclass in natural engineering. No student at the Academy had ever willingly gone into the Veth Hollows for recreational purposes. The standing guidance from the administration was clear. The hollows are not off-limits, but students who choose to enter them do so at their own risk and are required to log their entry and exit times. Marin logged her entry and exit times every single day. Precise, consistent, professional. I asked my colleague in the biology department, a Kelpie instructor named Felross, whether he had seen Marin in his wing. He told me she had checked out 11 techs in the past 2 weeks. Xenoskeletal engineering, organic material density distribution, evolutionary adaptation in apex predator bone structure. One book on ancient human weapon crafting techniques that he had not known was in the collection until she requested it. I called her into my office. She sat down across from me with the same settled ease she brought to every interaction bag on the floor, hands folded, attention complete. I've been hearing you spend a significant amount of time in the biology wing, I said. Yes, sir. Research for what? For my blade, sir. I told her the materials vault had complete molecular analysis of every substance in storage. Whatever she chose, she would understand it perfectly. She told me she appreciated that, but that she was not using anything from the vault. The words sat in the air between us. I asked her to explain. She reached into her bag and placed something on my desk. It was wrapped in dark cloth, and she unwrapped it with the kind of careful practice motion that suggested she had done it many times and considered it worth doing carefully. Beneath the cloth was a long, curved piece of bone, approximately 2 feet, dense at the proximal end, tapering toward the distal. The natural curve of it was striking, aggressive, forward-leaning, shaped by millions of years of evolutionary engineering into something that already looked to my eye as a weapons instructor unnervingly functional. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked at her. This is a femur from a Krothak hunting beast, she said. Her finger ran along the length of it with an ease that I found difficult to categorize. Not fearless, exactly. More like familiarity. This particular animal died about 6 months ago in a territorial dispute with another Krothak. Natural causes. The body was largely intact when I found the site. When you found the site, I repeated. Yes, sir. Marin, I leaned forward. That bone belongs to one of the most structurally extraordinary skeletal specimens in this region of the galaxy. It is also organic material, calcium-based. The hardness rating puts it well below most metals you could find in the vault. The moment that bone contacts durasteel under combat stress, it will shatter. She looked at me steadily. With respect, Sir, bone has been used as weapons by dozens of species throughout galactic history, including my own. My ancestors made weapons from bones when they were barely sapient. In the early periods of your species' development, I said, before you had access to anything better. You said we could use whatever material we wanted, she said. Her voice was still calm, but there was something under it now. Not anger, something more patient than anger. As long as we could forge it into a functional blade. Those were your exact words. She was right. She was completely, technically, unarguably right. I told her that if her material failed during the final examination, I could not adjust her grade. She told me she understood and was not asking me to. She picked up the bone, rewrapped it with the same careful attention, placed it back in her bag, and looked at me. 14 days, sir. I'll have a functional blade. She stood up, shouldered her bag, and walked to the door. She paused at the threshold. She did not turn around. I've been studying the fracture mechanics of Krothak femoral bone for 3 months, she said. I chose this academy specifically because Thos Prime is the only moon within 12 systems where Krothak have been documented. I knew what I needed before I enrolled. The door closed behind her. I sat in my office for a long time after that, in the silence with the cold iron smell coming through the walls and the distant sound of the other students working in the main workshop. I thought about the smile from the first day, the already certain smile, the smile of someone who had known before I finished my sentence what my answer was going to be. She had not been asking permission. She had been confirming what she already knew. I pulled her file back out and read it again. Informal but extensive weapons training. Strong performance in applied biology and material science. Enrolled under her own initiative, applications submitted 14 months before the semester began, approximately 3 months before most students even started their enrollment research. 14 months. I thought about what kind of person plans 14 months ahead to sit in a specific classroom on a specific moon for a specific piece of bone from a specific dead animal that she had already located before she arrived. Outside my window, the gas giant was rising on the horizon, enormous and unhurried, dragging color across the sky the way it always did at this hour. I opened a new page in my assessment log and wrote the first honest note I had made about a student in years. I don't know what she's going to do. I don't know if it will work. But whatever it is, she planned it before she walked through my door. And I have the uncomfortable feeling that she planned it better than I would have. I stared at that sentence. Then I added one more line. Pay attention. The main workshop has a sound when everything is working the way it should. It is not one sound exactly. It is a layering, the rhythmic percussion of hammers, finding metal, The sharp exhale of superheated material, meeting cooling baths, the low mechanical hum of the rotary grinders, and underneath all of it, the particular quality of concentration that fills a room when 62 people are doing difficult things and doing them seriously. After 17 cycles, I could walk into that workshop blindfolded and tell you whether the work was going well. The sound has a confidence to it when the students find their rhythm, a rightness. For the 2 weeks following my conversation with Maren Voss, that sound was exactly what I needed it to be. Vixara worked the way I expected her to work, with total commitment and zero humility. She had claimed the largest workstation in the front row, and she used all 6 arms with the fluid overlapping efficiency of a species that evolved for precisely this kind of multi-point task management. Her titanium alloy was the highest grade available in the vault. Her grip design was complex, ambitious, engineered to allow any combination of her 6 hands to find purchase without compromising balance. Watching her work was, I will admit, genuinely impressive. She had talent. She also knew she had talent, which is always a more complicated thing to manage. Dorath worked quietly 2 rows back the way Kolurth traditionalists have always worked. Methodical, patient. His folded steel was building layer by layer, the way his family had been building it for generations. Each folded decision, each decision recorded in the grain of the metal. There is a particular pride in traditional technique that I understand deeply, and watching Dorath work brought back something I had not felt in a long time, a kind of respect that does not require explanation. The other students made progress at their own pace. Some struggled, some surprised me. One of the Kelpie students produced an early draft that was genuinely promising. The workshop filled with the noise of real work being done. Maren's workstation remained empty. Not abandoned, empty. Her tools were there, laid out in their precise alignment, every instrument in its correct position, all of it clean and untouched. She came to every class. She participated in every group discussion. She answered questions with the same quiet accuracy that had marked her from the first day. But when the practical sessions began and the other students moved to their stations, Maren would stay for a while watching, and then she would walk to the back corridor and disappear into the private forging room she had requested on the first day of the semester. The private rooms are small, reinforced walls, independent ventilation, enhanced containment systems. We use them for students working with materials that carry a higher risk profile, unstable alloys, reactive composites, anything that needs to be isolated from the main space for safety reasons. Maren had submitted the request with clean paperwork and a listed reason that was technically accurate organic material, variable structural integrity, isolation recommended during initial processing phases. I approved it because the paperwork was correct. I noted the request in my log and moved on, telling myself I would follow up in a few days. I found out what she was doing on a Tuesday. The sound came at approximately the 3rd hour of the morning session, a sharp concussive report that cut through the workshop's layered noise the way lightning cuts through cloud cover. Not enormous, not the kind of explosion that sends people running for emergency protocols, but distinct, specific. The kind of sound that has a point of origin you can identify immediately. Every head in the workshop turned toward the back corridor. I was moving before I had consciously decided to move. I reached the door of the private forging room in seconds, with Dorath 2 steps behind me, and Vixara I noticed not far after him. I opened the door. The room was filled with a fine white dust that caught the light and turned the air into something gauzy and slow. The dust was settling as I entered, drifting down onto every surface in a thin, pale layer. On the floor across the workbench, across every surface in the room, were fragments. White, dense at the larger pieces, finer toward the edges where the fracture had propagated furthest. The distinct curved geometry of the proximal end was still identifiable in the largest fragment near the back wall. The rest was a gradient of decreasing size, distributed outward from a central point with a particular radial pattern of a controlled detonation. The bone had shattered completely. Maren was sitting on the floor in the center of it. She was not injured. I checked immediately and thoroughly. No lacerations, no burns, no signs of concussive impact. She was sitting cross-legged in the white dust with her hands resting on her knees, and she was looking at the fragments around her with an expression I did not have an immediate category for. Not devastated, not distressed, not the expression of someone who has watched months of work detonate in front of them. Focused. From the doorway behind me, I heard Vixara. The sound she made was quiet, but I had spent enough time with Vornak students to recognize the particular register of it. Satisfaction. The kind that arrives when a prediction is confirmed. I ignored her. I looked at Maren. Are you hurt? No, sir. What happened? She looked up at me, the same expression from the first day from my office, from every moment when she had information I did not yet have and was deciding how much of it to share. Not evasive, patient. Perfect, she said. Exactly what I needed. She reached out and picked up a fragment near her right knee, turned it in her fingers, set it down in a clear space beside her carefully like she was beginning a process. Then she reached for another fragment, sorting them by surface, by density, by the character of the fracture surface with the methodical attention of someone who had been waiting for this specific result. I stood in the doorway and watched her for a long moment. Then I walked back to the main workshop, sat down at my instructor's station, and wrote in my assessment log, "Student may be experiencing psychological stress. Recommend monitoring." I stared at that sentence for a while. I left it there. I said nothing more about it that day. 3 days later, Durath came to find me during the lunch break. He had the expression of someone who was not sure whether what he was about to say would be helpful or the opposite, but had decided the uncertainty was worth navigating. He led me back to the private quarter without speaking. He stopped outside the door of Marin's forging room and pointed at the narrow window set into the upper panel. I looked through it. The room had been transformed. The white dust was gone, cleaned away with the same thoroughness Marin applied to everything. The workbench had been cleared, and in the center of the room, suspended in the display field of a portable holographic projector, was a three-dimensional model of the Krothak femur, rendered in precise molecular detail, slowly rotating every stratum of its internal structure, mapped in layered translucent color. Across the model in deep red were lines, not random lines, not damage mapping applied after the fact. Precisely plotted trajectories, each one originating from a specific node in the bone's internal architecture and propagating outward according to the particular mechanical logic of how that material would fail under specific stress conditions. They followed the trabecular lattice. They traced the transition zones between the dense cortical exterior and the more porous interior layers. They intersected at angles that made a kind of cold geometric sense when I looked at them long enough. Marin was standing at the edge of the projection, adding annotations. She was not aware she was being watched. There was something in the quality of her concentration in that unobserved moment, something I had not seen from her before, because in every other interaction she had always been at least partially managing how she appeared. Here alone with her work, she was something else entirely. She was entirely in her element. I understood then what I had been looking at 3 days earlier. The explosion had not been an accident. It had not been a failure of technique or a misjudgment of material stress. It had been an experiment with a predetermined success condition, and the success condition was precisely what happened: the bone fracturing under specific controlled stress, the fragments distributing in the pattern. She needed the fracture lines mapping themselves onto the material's actual failure geometry, rather than the theoretical geometry she could only model before the fact. She had destroyed the bone on purpose, to learn exactly where it wanted to break. And now she was using that information to determine exactly where it must not break, which structural zones needed reinforcement, which load paths needed to be rerouted, which molecular transitions needed to be treated differently than the surrounding material. I turned away from the window. I walked back to my office. I found that sentence in my assessment log and added 3 words beneath it: disregard previous note. That evening, I went to find Silvix in her laboratory in the Materials Science Building. She was surrounded by spectroscopic displays and samples of crystalline alloy structure in various stages of analysis. She looked up when I came in with the slightly distracted expression of someone whose brain was still mostly in a different room. I told her what I had seen, all of it: the initial request, the Veth hollows, the months of biological research, the calculated explosion, the fracture mapping. Silvex was quiet for a moment. She deliberately stress-tested the material to catastrophic failure, she said, to map fracture propagation paths in actual rather than theoretical conditions. Yes, that is a standard procedure in advanced composite alloy testing. We use it during the development phase for new military-grade materials. She paused. The equipment required for precise fracture mapping under controlled conditions costs approximately 40,000 credits. When she used a rock and a hammer, I said, as far as I can tell. Silvex looked at me for a long moment. Then she pulled out the stool beside her workbench and sat down on it with the particular care of someone whose legs had just become slightly less reliable than they were a moment ago. I need to sit down, she said. You are sitting down. I needed to sit down more, she said. I left her there and walked back across the campus in the dark. The gas giant had fully risen by then, sitting on the horizon like something permanent, its rings catching the distant sun and scattering the light in ways that turned the whole eastern sky into a slow-moving spectrum. I stopped for a moment and looked at it. 40,000 credits. A rock and a hammer. 19 years old. I thought about the word primitive, which Vexera had used in the first week, and how that word was going to feel when I remembered it later. Then I went back to my workshop and stood at my instructor's station for a while, looking at the 63 empty workstations, thinking about what was going to happen in 7 days. I did not write anything in my log that night. Some things are not improved by being made into notes. 1 week before the final examination, I called Marin in for what I told her was a routine progress review. She sat across from me, bag on the floor, hands folded, attention complete. The same as always. Except this time she reached into her bag without being asked and placed something on the desk between us. It was the bone, or what the bone was becoming. Not finished. The shaping was still in progress, the final edge geometry not yet fully defined, the grip section still in its early wrapping stage. But the form was unmistakable. The curve of it had been refined, enhanced from the natural geometry of the original femur into something more deliberate, the forward sweep of it optimized for what I recognized from years of teaching as a very specific cutting application. I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected. Much heavier. Whatever she had done to the material in the weeks since the fracture mapping session, it had changed the density profile in ways I could feel without instruments. I turned it in my hands, ran my thumb along the surface near what would become the primary edge. There was something there, a quality to the material that I did not have clean vocabulary for. Not metal, not the familiar hardness of alloy. Something older than that, something that had spent millions of years being shaped by a process more patient and more rigorous than anything we do in a forge. I tried to flex it. Nothing. I tried to apply lateral pressure across the grain at the narrowest point where any blade made from organic material would be most vulnerable to fracture. Nothing. I set it down on the desk between us. If this breaks during the combat demonstration, I said, Aris, I cannot help you. The examination criteria are fixed. Marin looked at the bone on the desk. Then she looked at me. I know, sir, she said. I'm not asking you to. The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere across the campus, a forge was running its late cooling cycle, the rhythmic sound of it carrying through the walls. I looked at her, at the bone between us, at the 17 cycles of teaching that had brought me to this specific moment. 7 days, I said. Yes, sir, she said. 7 days. She picked up the bone, wrapped it carefully, put it in her bag, stood up and left. I sat alone for a long time after that. At some point, Durath knocked on the open office door on his way out of the workshop, saw my expression, decided wisely not to ask, and kept walking. I appreciated that more than I told him. For the first time in 17 cycles, I genuinely did not know what was going to happen next. I found to my considerable surprise that the feeling was not entirely unpleasant. It was something older than comfort and more honest, the feeling of being present in something you cannot predict, which is the feeling the universe offers when it decides to actually show you something. I locked up the workshop and went home. The arena smells different on examination day. I have never been able to fully explain this to colleagues who have not spent time in it. The space itself does not change, same reinforced walls, same tiered viewing platforms, same floor that can be reconfigured into any terrain the curriculum requires. But on examination day, with the stands filling and the sound of hundreds of voices layering into that particular frequency of collective anticipation, the arena takes on a quality that is almost atmospheric, something between ceremony and violence. The smell of heated metal from the preparation tunnels, the sharp mineral scent of the Durasteel test plate being set into its mounting posts, the underlying current of ozone from the training drone systems running their pre-activation diagnostics. I arrived early. I ran through the equipment checks myself, verified the synthetic tissue targets, confirmed the aluminum test columns, inspected the Durasteel plate. I reviewed the scoring criteria. I did the checks twice. My hands needed something to do. The stands began filling an hour before the session opened. Students from other courses, faculty from several departments, including Silvex, who took a position in the second tier with a data tablet she held but never once looked at, administrative staff, a small number of civilian visitors who had heard through whatever channels these things travel that the Academy's first human student was presenting today, and 3 figures in the formal dress uniform of the Cold-Earth Defense Force who settled into the reserve section at the top tier of the eastern platform and spoke to no one. I had not invited them. I had not been informed they were coming. I looked at their insignia, senior assessment officers, the kind attached to the Military Council's Materials Research Division, And I made a note to find out after all of this was over exactly what they had been briefed on and by whom. The examination proceeded through the morning. Each student was called in turn. Each one walked onto the arena floor, presented their blade, and moved through the three-stage demonstration. Some performed exactly as I had expected. Some exceeded their own recent progress in ways that genuinely pleased me. Vixara's six-grip titanium construction was exceptional by any objective measure. Her combat demonstration, fluid efficient and exactly as devastating as 6 arms and months of serious preparation could make it. I gave her the grade she had earned. It was a high one, just one. Durith's folded steel was something I would remember for a long time, the patterns in the metal moving like water under the arena lights, his performance grounded and precise and entirely his own. By early afternoon, only one name remained on my list. I let the pause hold for a moment. The ambient conversation in the stands had tapered into something more focused. I was aware of the 3 defense officers in the eastern platform sitting very still. Marin Voss, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the space. Human, please enter the arena. The preparation tunnel on the south side was dark for a moment. Then she walked out. She was the same height she had always been. The same quiet bearing, the same practical knot in her hair, the same absence of anything that announced itself. She wore no ceremonial additions to her uniform and made no concession to the occasion's theater. She walked to the center of the arena floor with the same steady, unhurried steps she used to cross a classroom, and she stopped and she looked up at the instructor box. What she was carrying stopped me cold. I had held the bone in my hand 7 days earlier, unfinished, its final form still emerging. What Marin carried onto that arena floor was something else. The shaping was complete. The curve had been refined to a geometry that I recognized in the first second of seeing it as exactly right, not decorative, not approximate, but the product of someone who understood precisely what a cutting edge needs to be and had made it that way. The grip wrapping was tight and functional, textured for purchase under stress. The surface of the bone had been worked to a finish that caught the arena lights and held them not with the hard flash of polished metal, but with something deeper, a luminosity that came from within the material rather than from its surface. The etchings along its length caught my eye last. Patterns that ran from the grip to within an inch of the point, following the natural grain of the material, neither purely decorative nor purely functional, but somehow in the way the best weapons always are, completely both. She held it at her side loosely with the relaxed grip of someone who had been holding it long enough for it to feel like an extension of her hand. Instructor Craven, she said, her voice carrying cleanly across the space, I present my blade for examination. I realized my mandibles had been hanging open. I closed them. Proceed with the demonstration, I said. The first target was synthetic tissue, the standard flesh approximation we use to assess cutting performance on organic material. Marin approached it with the economic movement that had become familiar to me over the course of the semester. No wasted motion, no performance. She set her stance, assessed the target for one breath, then cut. The bone blade entered the synthetic tissue at the shoulder and exited at the opposite hip in a single diagonal motion, and the target came apart with the clean finality of something that had ceased in that instant to be a single object. 2 pieces, perfect cross-section. No drag, no deviation, no evidence of the blade catching or slowing at any point in the cut. The crowd made a sound, not applause yet, something more involuntary than that. The second target was aluminum alloy. A standard test column 6 inches in diameter, dense enough to reveal everything meaningful about edge retention and cutting power against hard materials. Marin shifted her grip slightly, the smallest adjustment, barely visible from the instructor box, but deliberate, and swung. The sound the bone blade made passing through that metal was not what I expected. Not the dull impact of a blade working against resistance. It was high and clean, a singing quality that I had never heard from a blade hitting aluminum before. Something resonating rather than cutting. The columns separated and the cross-section caught the light as it fell, and I activated the edge analysis scanner before I had consciously decided to do so. The readout came back clean. Not a single chip on the cutting edge. Not a single area of compression, deformation along the contact zone. The bone had passed through metal and emerged on the other side exactly as it had entered. Behind me, I heard Silvex make a sound that I will not attempt to describe. Marin Voss, I said, my voice more controlled than I felt. Proceed to target 3. The Durasteel plate, 2 inches of the hardest structural material in standard military use, suspended between its mounting posts with the particular quality of solid permanence that Durasteel always projects. The test is not to cut through it. No hand-forged blade in my 17 cycles had ever cut through it. The test is depth of penetration. A quarter inch is adequate. Half an inch is excellent. The Academy record held by a Vornax graduate from 9 cycles earlier was 1.25 inches. Marin stood in front of the plate and looked at it. The arena was completely silent. Then she did something that sent a current through the entire space. She raised her left hand. She turned the bone blade slightly in her right, and she drew the pad of her thumb with slow deliberateness across the primary cutting edge. A thin line of red appeared on her skin. No pressure applied, no sawing motion, just contact. The crowd reacted, a sound that moved through the stands like a wave. She had done it for exactly the reason I instantly understood. Not for drama, not to perform confidence, but to state something clearly and publicly that could not be argued with afterward. The edge was not approximate. It was not adequate. It was absolute. She was telling everyone in that arena in the most direct language available what was about to happen to the Durasteel plate. She turned back to the target. She set her feet. She breathed once. She swung. The impact rang out like a bell, a clear, resonant strike that echoed off the arena walls and came back from multiple directions simultaneously. There was a silence of perhaps 2 full seconds. Then I activated the measurement scanners. The number appeared on the display screens around the arena perimeter. 1.75 inches. Nobody moved for a moment. Not in the stands, not on the arena floor, not in the instructor box. The number sat on the screens in clean white figures, and the entire arena looked at it with the collective stillness of people recalibrating something fundamental about what they had believed was possible. Then I saw the fractures. Fine lines running along the length of the blade from the impact point toward the grip, not random, not the chaotic propagation of catastrophic failure, but precise branching along specific paths with a geometric regularity that I recognized in the space of one breath from the holographic model I had seen through the window of Marin's private forging room 2 weeks earlier. Craven. Silvex was beside me. Her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. She had abandoned any pretense of using her data tablet and was gripping the railing of the instructor box with both hands. Those fracture lines, they're not random. I know. She engineered them. They're following the trabecular lattice paths. She mapped the natural failure geometry, and then she treated the material so that stress redistributes along those specific paths instead of propagating toward the cutting edge. She paused. The cutting edge is completely intact. The fractures are absorbing the impact force away from the blade's functional surface. The blade was not failing. The blade was working. The fracture lines were not damage. They were the mechanism. Marin had not just hardened bone. She had reverse engineered the way bone naturally absorbs impact, the same process that allows a living skeleton to take enormous stress without shattering, and she had replicated it in a dead piece of material using chemistry, pressure, patience, and the fracture map she had deliberately created by destroying the original specimen on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago, 1.75 inches. The record broken by half an inch with a blade made of organic material by a 19-year-old human in 1 semester. The combat demonstration was last. I set the training drone to maximum difficulty. I want to be clear about that decision. It was mine, deliberate, made in the full awareness of what I was doing. I had set it to intermediate for every other student. For Marin, I moved the setting to the top of the scale. Not from malice, not from doubt, because I had spent 3 weeks watching her prepare for this, and I wanted to see where the ceiling actually was. The drone rolled onto the arena floor and ran its activation sequence. At maximum difficulty, its combat programming draws from a library of over 40,000 documented engagement sequences, selecting and combining them in real time based on opponent movement and response. It is genuinely difficult to defeat at this setting. Marin rolled her shoulders once, adjusted her grip, looked at the drone with the same expression she had brought to every practical problem I had ever seen her face. The drone struck first. It always does. What happened over the next 90 seconds, I will attempt to describe accurately, knowing the description will fall short. Marin did not fight the drone the way my other students fought it. She did not meet force with force or try to overpower an opponent that outweighed her by several hundred pounds. She fought with geometry and timing. She moved like water, finding the path of least resistance. Placing herself at angles, the drone's programming was not optimized to anticipate attacking joints and articulation points rather than armored surfaces, using the bone blade as a precision instrument applied to exactly the right location at exactly the right moment. 3 cuts across the torso, a parry that redirected a lateral strike into empty space, a strike to the shoulder joint that on a living opponent would have ended everything. The drone adapted. It shifted to a faster combination sequence, pressing forward with relentless mechanical aggression. And this is the part I want to be clear about. Marin breathed harder. I saw it clearly from the instructor box, the first visible evidence of cost of genuine effort of the physical reality that she was a 19-year-old human with no armor and no augmentation operating at the absolute limit of what preparation and training could provide. She was not untouchable. She was not effortless. She was genuinely working. And the bone blade held through every contact, every parry, every stress point of 90 seconds of maximum difficulty combat. Not a chip. Not a structural failure outside the engineered distribution lines. Not a single moment where the material became the limiting factor. The drone registered critical damage and began its shutdown sequence. Marin stepped back. She stood still for a moment, hand on her knee, breathing, the bone blade hanging at her side. Then she straightened and looked up at the instructor box. The arena was silent. I looked back at her, at the blade, at the record still sitting on the display screens. Then I looked at the three defense officers in the eastern platform. They were no longer sitting still. The senior officer, a broad-shouldered Colorth colonel whose insignia marked her as attached to the Military Council's Applied Research Division, had leaned forward and she was looking at Marin's blade with the precise evaluative attention of someone doing rapid calculations. She caught me watching her and held my gaze for a moment. Then she said loud enough to carry, "Instructor Craven, we will need to speak after this session." I nodded once. Later. After. "Marin Voss," I said, and I let my voice reach every corner of the space. "I have one question." She waited. "Why bone?" The silence extended. She looked down at the blade in her hand, and for a moment her expression was something I had never quite seen from her before. Not the settled composure of someone managing the distance between themselves and what they are doing, but something genuine and present and unhurried. "My ancestors made weapons from bones before they had words for what they were doing," she said. Her voice was even pitched to carry. "They picked up what the world gave them and they made it work. People look at that and they see primitiveness. I look at it and I see a question that nobody ever went back to ask." She held the blade up and the arena lights moved across its surface. Bone isn't a fallback material. It isn't second choice. It's a material that evolution spent millions of years testing under real conditions, and the design it arrived at is extraordinary. It absorbs impact. It distributes force. It flexes without catastrophic failure. No metallurgist engineered that. Natural selection did. And nobody in this academy ever thought to ask what happens if you take that ancient design and give it everything we've learned since. She lowered the blade. "You told us to make a weapon that was an extension of ourselves. This is mine. Humans take the discarded and the overlooked in the ancient. We ask the question nobody bothered to ask, and then we make it work." The silence held for one breath, two. Vexera stood up. She did not say anything. She did not make any of the approving vocalizations that Vornax used for formal acknowledgement. She simply rose to her full height, all 6 arms at her sides, and began to clap. Slowly, deliberately. One by one the stands followed. The 3 defense officers descended from the eastern platform before the applause had fully settled. The colonel reached me first. Her 2 colleagues fanned out behind her with the practiced arrangement of people who have done this kind of thing before. "That treatment process," she said without preamble, "the fracture mapping combined with the differential density reinforcement. Is it documented anywhere?" "In her project notes," I said, "which are her property until she chooses otherwise." The colonel looked at Marin, who was walking toward us from the arena floor, blade at her side, expression unreadable. "We have been funding biological materials research for 30 years, the colonel said. 30 years in 6 research divisions. We have produced theoretical models promising preliminary results in a great deal of very expensive equipment." She paused. "We have not produced that." Her colleague, a younger officer with the insignia of the engineering corps, spoke without looking away from the blade. "The stress distribution architecture alone, if it can be scaled and replicated in field conditions, changes the calculus for low-resource military manufacturing on at least 40 documented conflict zones." I looked at them, at Marin, who had stopped a few feet away and was listening with the calm attention she brought to everything. "She's a student," I said. "She came here to learn bladecraft." "She came here," the colonel said quietly, "because this moon has Krothak. She told us that herself. In a research proposal she submitted to the Council's Open Innovation Registry 14 months ago." She looked at me steadily. "We approved the funding for her enrollment. We have been waiting to see if the theory held. The arena was still full of noise, students talking as stands emptying. Gradually, the drone technicians running their post-session diagnostics. All of it continued around us, ordinary and indifferent, while I stood in the instructor box and understood that I had been the last person in the room to know what was actually happening. I looked at Marin. She looked back at me. And there was the smile, not mysterious this time, not performing certainty, but something honest and a little apologetic, and entirely characteristically her. You knew, I said. I knew the bone would work, she said. I didn't know if you'd let me try it. And if I hadn't, she considered that for a moment with the genuine seriousness she brought to actual questions. I would have found another academy, she said. But you said students could use whatever they found. And I'd read your published work on unconventional materials. I thought you'd say yes. You read my published work. You wrote a paper in Cycle 31 arguing that the Academy's vault-only policy was creating systematic blind spots in weapons development, she said. It was rejected by the editorial board. I thought it was correct. I stared at her. Behind me, I heard Silvex make the same sound she had made when the aluminum column fell in two pieces. It was becoming her default setting for this afternoon. Later, after the grades were finalized and the arena had emptied, and the defense officers had taken Marin somewhere to discuss things above my clearance level, I sat in my office in the quiet. The forge was cold. The academy had settled into the particular stillness of an institution that has finished one cycle and has not yet begun the next. I opened my end-of-semester report and wrote the sections I always write: grade distributions, curriculum notes, equipment, maintenance recommendations. Then I turned to the final section. It is recommended that future cohorts be formally encouraged to consider materials outside the standard vault inventory. The boundary between primitive and advanced, between ancient and modern, is less fixed than our curriculum has assumed. Last semester, a student demonstrated that a piece of organic material could exceed the performance of military-grade alloys under real combat conditions. She did this by asking a question that 17 cycles of instruction at this academy had not thought to ask. She then answered that question with a rock, a hammer, and a great deal of patience. This approach is recommended. I sent the report. The commandant's message arrived within the hour. Your student has started something. My analysts are calling it a materials reconsideration. 30 years of funded research in biological applications produced nothing viable. One semester with a human student produced a blade that broke the academy record and is currently being reviewed by 3 separate military engineering divisions. My engineers want to know why we didn't think of it sooner. I read that message twice. Then I typed my response. I taught a class. The student did the rest. If you want to know why no one thought of it sooner, I'd suggest asking what questions your curriculum has been discouraging people from asking. I sent it before I had time to reconsider the tone. Then I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. Outside my window, the gas giant had fully risen, sitting enormous and indifferent above the horizon, its rings scattering light across the northern sky in slow arcs that had nothing to do with anything except the simple physics of light and distance and time. I had looked at that same view from this same window for 17 cycles. It had never once suggested to me that I was missing something. I thought about Marin Voss somewhere on this campus tonight, probably already looking at the next question. Probably already planning with that patience and that smile the answer she would build before anyone else had noticed there was something worth building. I thought about the 14 months of preparation that had looked from the outside like a 19-year-old girl walking into a classroom with nothing. I thought about the fracture map and the rock and the hammer and the 40,000 credits. I pulled out the notes I had been revising for the next semester's opening speech. I found the paragraph and read it back to myself in the empty office. You have access to our materials vault, which contains samples from hundreds of worlds. But you also have access to something larger than that. You have access to every material the universe has ever produced and every question nobody has thought to ask about it yet. Last semester, a student made a blade from bone. It was one of the finest weapons I have ever seen produced in 17 cycles of teaching. Don't limit yourself to the obvious choices. Look at what others walk past. Ask the question that hasn't been asked. Then make it work. I set down the notes. In my assessment log still open on my desk, I found the entry I had written on the first day of the semester. I don't know what she's going to do. I don't know if it will work. Beneath it, in the space I had left, I wrote one final line. I was wrong about what I didn't know. I was right about paying attention. The forge would be cold until morning. The new semester would begin in 3 weeks. 63 new students would walk through the door and find their seats according to whatever hierarchies they carried with them, and I would stand at the front of the room and give the speech, and somewhere in the room there would be someone I had not yet learned to be surprised by. I found sitting alone in my office with the impossible slow light of the gas giant coming through the window and the weight of everything I had just witnessed settling into something I could begin to understand that I could not wait. The galaxy I was beginning to suspect had been dealing with human surprises for as long as humans had been looking at the universe and asking what everyone else had forgotten to ask. It was simply that the rest of us were only now starting to pay attention.